The opening of the work, in many ways, sets the tone for the rest of the novel. We see at the very opening a contrast between Mr. and Mrs. Bennett and what a good marriage ought to be like. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett are comical, it's true. Mr. Bennett is very cynical and Mrs. Bennett is very flighty. Mr. Bennett concerns himself with only his books. He wants to be quiet and left alone by other people. Mrs. Bennett wants to be concerned directly with society and getting her daughters married. The two characters seem very incompatible with one another, and he is always telling jokes at her expense and biting her behind her back, and she is always seeing him as being intractable and unflexible. The two of them seem very incompatible, but notice that they are, in some ways, examples of pride and prejudice. He is definitely proud. He's very aloof. He takes himself away from society and sits in his little cave, his little study room. And she, on the other hand, is very prejudiced, immediately thinking things that are probably not true. She thinks, for instance, that the purchase of the house next door means that her daughters are going to be married. And as is pointed out in William de Reshwick's article, Community and Cognition in Pride and Prejudice, this opening is in some ways crucial to understanding the rest of the story. This is what de Reshwick says. The opening of Pride and Prejudice vies with Call Me Ishmael from Moby Dick as the most famous first sentence in English language fiction. Yet that which makes it memorable also makes it anomalous within its author's corpus. Each of Jane Austen's other novels begins by introducing one of its principal characters. Only Pride and Prejudice begins with an aphorism. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. An aphorism, or rather a mock aphorism, for it is immediately intimated that this truth, universally acknowledged, is in fact nothing more than one of the fixed opinions of the neighborhood of surrounding families, amidst which the novel's action is to take place. Part of what de Reshwick is pointing out in his article, and what we see immediately, is that Mr. and Mrs. Bennett represent fixed notions in society, people that are so fixed in their ways that it's very unlikely they're going to change. Neither one of them is happy. Both of them are always picking at one another. But neither one of them is able to free themselves from the opinions and the ideas and the expectations of society so that they can actually be free. You know, most interpreters think that Elizabeth, the second daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, is already free from societal thought and from opinions and prejudices. But as de Reshwick goes on to point out, she really isn't free at all, even from the beginning of the story. She's already herself showing signs of her father's pride and of her mother's prejudice. De Reshwick says this: a host of readers have emphasized Elizabeth's individuality and imaginative freedom, but in crucial ways she is not free, and very little of an individualist, ways in which her story must be seen not as an exercise of freedom, but as an effort to achieve freedom, not as a light-footed dance away from a community that cannot contain her, but as a struggle to wake herself out of a community in which she is all too comfortably embedded. From this point of view, Pride and Prejudice can be seen as Austen's most deliberate and sustained critique of community. Most of us have grown up with the idea of the young heroine being very literate and very wise and very thoughtful and not being able to be contained by society. But that's not apparently what Jane Austen was actually writing about. She was writing about a young lady who was very wise and was very well read, but was nevertheless definitely a member of society, somebody who was very much contained by the opinions of society. And at the very opening, Elizabeth is very eager to go to the ball. But notice she's not a big flamboyant character at the very beginning of the story. The flamboyant characters are Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. Elizabeth is in some ways sidelined. And it's not until the third chapter here that we actually have Elizabeth becoming even noticed as a character. And she's noticed when Darcy enters the room. Darcy enters the room and basically says that there are no acceptable women to dance with. He himself doesn't want to dance with anybody, particularly at the ball, because he knows that women essentially see him for his money first and foremost. And that's exactly what happens. When he enters into the ball, notice, people notice that he's handsome. He's there with his friend Mr. Bingley, sort of as his wingman, so to speak. But he's aloof from everybody else. The first impression that people have of him, though, is that he's wealthy. Notice this. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women, with an air of decided fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report, which was in general circulation, within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. The gentlemen pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man. The ladies declared he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley, and he was looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, till his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity, for he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased, and not all his large estate in Derbyshire could then save him from having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance, and being unworthy to be compared with his friend. You see here, Mr. Bingley is seen as good-looking, and he's wealthy, but he's also charming, he's pleasing, he pleases everybody around him, and so the opinion of everybody else, the prejudice of everybody else, is that he's a very good man, and they like him very much. That's why, in some ways, Mrs. Bennett wants her daughters to marry Mr. Bingley. Mr. Darcy is also seen as very handsome, but he's mostly seen as handsome because he has so much money, so much cash. It's only later, when he's seen as proud, because he won't talk to people and he's not happy and cheerful and lively, that everybody says that he's too proud, he's too full of himself, and all the money in the world can't save him from being seen as a proud figure. Everybody's prejudiced against him because he won't play their games. He won't stoop to their level, so to speak. He won't talk with anybody. But we've got to think about his position, too. Darcy has all his life been hunted for his money, and women have always seen him as a figure for cash. Gold diggers surround him, so to speak. And so he stays aloof from them. His aloofness is very understandable in some ways, because he has grown up in a world where people expect so much of him. But perhaps that aloofness is itself the cage that keeps him bound. He is himself bound by the very things that he's surrounded himself with. His whole society makes him a prisoner of pride. And so, very much like Mr. Bennett, he retreats frequently to his own realm, his own world. And very much like Mrs. Bennett, Elizabeth sees him immediately as a dislikable character, disagreeable character. With that pride and that prejudice, the two young people, Elizabeth and Darcy, have the tension or the threat of possibly becoming like a Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett representing the bad couple at the very beginning of the story. And it's this very prison of their own making that they have to break out of in order to be truly free, become free individuals and enlightened.